Hi guys, it's Fights Out here with yet another video, and today we're going to be discussing one of the biggest problems with modern boxing, padded records. Let's break it down. Now, in order to understand why this is such a problem, we need to kind of go back 50 years to Ali Frazier 1. Now, obviously that fight is considered one of the best fights ever, rightfully so. Ali is considered one of, if not the greatest boxers ever, by many boxing historians and hardcore fans, as well as casuals. But basically, it was with that fight. Essentially, what that fight did was place an emphasis on the zero of both guys. Ali was undefeated going into that fight, and Frazier was also undefeated. And it was a problem that would plague boxing forever up until this point. So the reason this became so prominent, because even if you look past Ali and Frazier, I know at a certain point in the 2000s, Bernard Hopkins was on the pound for pound list, and he had at least 4 losses on his record. Now you'll be hard pressed to find a guy on the pound for pound list with any more than 2 or 3 losses. You know what I mean? Only 2 I can think of is Lomachenko and Canelo. Those guys have great bodies of work, so it makes sense why they're on the pound for pound list. I can't think of another fighter that's been defeated on the pound for pound list other than those 2 guys. I mean, maybe Charlo is on the Rings pound for pound list, the smaller Charlo brother. Other than him, other than those 3 guys, those are pretty much the only 3 guys with losses on their record on the pound for pound list. But as of more recently, specifically like the 2010s especially, there was a big emphasis on padded records and protecting your O. Why did this become a problem? Well, with arguably one of the best boxers ever. I don't know if I'd 100% put him in my top 10 pound for pound ever, but he's definitely like top 15 best ever. Floyd Money Mayweather. Basically, as we know, Floyd is one of the only boxers to retire undefeated. Him, Andre Ward, Joe Calzaghe, and Rocky Marciano, if you want to go a little further back in history, are like pretty much the only 4 like elite boxers I can think of, 4 champions basically, that retired with their O still intact. And obviously those guys are some of the best guys in their respective divisions, you know, or the multiple weight classes they reigned across, you know, pound for pound. But it's the truth of the matter is that's not really realistic. Canelo is a guy who I would consider probably one of the top 5 best guys of the 2010s. He has 2 losses on his record. Arguably, so far at least, the best fighter of the 2020s, of the 2020 decade. You know, and he has 2 losses on his record, you know, and he's willing to take risky fights. You know, Mayweather, did he take risky fights in his career? Sure, but there was a certain amount of cherry picking he would do that kind of made other boxers kind of do the kind of things he did. Now, why is this really a problem? Well, as it suggests, 0's means that you're undefeated, probably means you've taken on some at least decent guys in your career if you're a world champion. But it usually means you've never really taken on any really truly tough fights or have never truly been tested. And it's basically as a result, we don't get any super fights, aka the fans don't really get the fights they want to see. Good example of this is Canelo. You know, Canelo doesn't cherry pick as much as Mayweather, but let's make no mistake, his career has been carefully curated up until this point. And he was going to fight this guy called Badu, not to get too off topic because this video is not mainly about Canelo, but Canelo was going to fight this guy named Badu Jack. And Badu Jack is cruiserweight and 2 weight classes above him. It's clearly, but he's also almost 40 years old. Canelo's going to make him fight at a catch weight. Canelo's going to include a rehydration clause. And it's clearly a manufactured super fight, quote unquote. It was not going to be a good fight. Now, thankfully, from what I'm hearing, Canelo's going to be fighting Charlo, which is a much better fight. But still, that's the kind of stuff these boxers try to do. They try to pick the lowest reward fights for the highest amount of pay. Basically, lowest risk for highest reward. Basically, low risk fights that give them high pay. Basically, fights that on paper look tough, but are really just so much skewed in their direction, either from skills or through different contractual agreements, what have you. Now that I covered the risk-reward factor point, I feel it's important to cover this next point, probably even more important. Rival promoters and rival networks, constant competition. Let's break this next part down. A little bit more to it. Now, essentially what this next part boils down to is that, so I'll use MMA and the UFC as an example. In MMA, you have PFL, the UFC, and Bellator are pretty much the three main, I would say, promotions. UFC, those other, you may have heard of Bellator, but PFL probably not. But more than likely, if you're a casual combat sports fan, you've probably never heard of those other two organizations. There's a reason for that. Dana is clearly the only guy in town, or not the only guy, but the biggest show in town is the UFC. He's the best at promoting it. He's the best at selling the fights, as every Saturday night is a super fight, even when it's not like a title fight. He's the best at selling it. There's a reason why the guy's worth $500 million, and that's pretty much about it with UFC and MMA. But just to draw an example, there's really only one show in town. In boxing, however, there's at least 3 different shows in town. Main ones being Top Rank, I would include number 1. Has the best lineup, best roster. Consistently puts on great fights. Number 2, I'd include PBC and Showtime. They have a lot of great. They have great lineup, and they also have a lot of super fights going on this year. Mainly Canelo and Charlo. Not sure if it's 100% official yet, but that fight is reportedly agreed to. They just need to figure out a date. And Spence and Crawford, just to name 2. And obviously with Top Rank, Haney Loma was also probably going to be considered one of the biggest fights this year. What I was going to say was and after that you have Matchroom, which has a decent lineup, but usually doesn't consistently put on great fights. You'll get pretty good fights here and there, but nothing crazy. And then in dead last, in the 4-horse race, I'd include Golden Boy and Oscar De La Hoya. If the first 3 are neck and neck, the last one, Oscar De La Hoya, is really he was pretty good a few years ago when he had the combination of, Reynoso managing Canelo. He had Canelo and Ryan Garcia. He's definitely the last now, because not only did he lose Canelo in a pretty heated legal battle, but also might be losing Ryan Garcia in another really heated legal battle that's really starting to get very messy. As well as not having, the absolute greatest lineup. It's essentially the 4-horse race explained in terms of promotional companies. Basically, why these guys clash with each other is obviously A, competition, and B, when there's going to be, cross-promotional contracts being made between fighters of two different promotions. Take, for example, Garcia and Tank. Usually the guy that has the A side, let's say Tank in this case, usually, here's the thing, right? We as fans want super fights. And obviously, as shown by this year, super fights are definitely still possible in a 4-belt era in modern boxing. The thing about it, historically, more like in the 2010s, but historically, why these fights don't happen is because promoters want to protect their fighters. As I said, protect their O. They don't want their fighter getting fucked over, which is understandable. They lose their money, they may lose their fighter, etc., etc. And that actually ties well into my next point, Ryan Garcia. Ryan Garcia basically kind of took a bum deal with Gervonta Davis. Hindsight being 2020, it was super hyped up fight. Definitely kind of got the wheels spinning with boxing, because now you see all these other super fights happening. Charlo Canelo, as I mentioned before. Charlo Canelo, Crawford Spence, Haney Loma, Tank Garcia, Benavidez Plant. I mean, the list could go on and on. I'm sure there's others. In a way, Fulton. I think those are pretty much the only ones worth mentioning. I'm sure there's others, but basically those are the main ones. But the point I'm trying to make with Garcia and Tank is that basically Tank's team included a rehydration clause, which pretty much only benefited Tank. Basically, a rehydration clause is when you weigh in fight day and you have to make a certain weight, otherwise the fight's off and your purse is withheld. Catch weight at a weight Garcia was not comfortable making, 136 pounds, which I think is kind of bullshit. I think it should have been at 135 legit. Should have been for Tank's interim WBA belt, or WBA regular belt, whatever the fuck you want to call it. But basically, those two main things really hurt Garcia. Obviously, that's not entirely why Garcia lost the fight. I mean, there was definitely a skill disparity there that even if he was allowed to fight at his biggest and baddest, he probably still wouldn't have won, but kind of got the result we got with that fight. And that's kind of what I mean with promoters that really try to protect their fighters. I think personally, I think De La Hoya knew that Oscar's, not starlight per se, but his kind of whole star power was starting to fade a bit and that it needed to be rejuvenated. Because basically, let's be honest, and Garcia is one of the biggest examples of this. He's probably one of the biggest examples of a padded record. The guy, before fighting Gervonta Davis, was 23-0. Maybe he has one good name on his resume, Luke Campbell, who was an elite contender back in his day. Probably was only in his prime when he fought Loma and Linares. Ryan doesn't really deserve too much credit for fighting Luke Campbell, but still credit to him for beating Luke Campbell. Basically beat Luke Campbell that got off the couch, and that's kind of my point. Ryan Garcia wasn't quite ready for a Gervonta Davis fight. And basically that, taking that bum deal that really only favored Gervonta Davis kind of sealed the deal. Now, how to fix it? Now, I'm not an expert on the ins and outs of boxing. I don't even pretend to be. I know a lot more about the technical, martial science of boxing, and even that I only know about 5% of. So the actual business and legality of boxing I know about basically close to zero. But how to fix it is if I guess in simple terms is if these promoters can kind of meet in the middle, maybe like give up certain allowances here and there, make certain concessions here and there with their fighter, and then the opposing promoter can do the same with their fighter and kind of make it even Stevens. Like, maybe like let's say one guy, the A side chooses the ring size and the glove size, and he gets announced second and walks out second, and then maybe the B side chooses like at least one out of the three judges. You know what I mean? Stuff like that. Just to make it a bit fair, or fairer than it has been. All that being said, boxing has been better recently, but there is still a fair degree of work to be done with padded records. Let's hope boxing can keep this up for years to come and go back to its rightful place as one of the main sports of the American market. Fight Size signing out.